Hi, I'm going to talk about Earle Brown and his music for cello and piano. Earle Brown is a major American composer and innovator, and he had a profound impact on music and aesthetics in the post-war period, certainly in the United States, but also in Europe. And I want to talk about him because he tends to get somewhat less attention than he deserves, certainly less than his somewhat more famous colleagues such as John Cage and Morton Feldman. But nevertheless, Earle Brown is a very, very significant musical figure, and he had a profound impact and influence on an entire generation of composers. And he wrote what, in my view, is some of the finest music of the entire period. And I want to focus on this particular piece, Music for Cello and Piano, which is a wonderful piece for all sorts of reasons, and it deserves to be heard more often than it is. So I'm going to start off with a general introduction to Earle Brown and his music and his aesthetics. I'm going to zero in on Music for Cello and Piano, talk about how this piece works and what makes it tick. And then I'm going to do something that I've wanted to do for a while, which is take a piece that is basically an open form piece and compare different recordings to see what they have in common. So that's what I'll do. So just to start things off, here's a sort of general background on Earle Brown. Earle Brown had a very atypical background for a composer of his generation. He was born in 1926 and started out as a jazz trumpeter. So he played in jazz orchestras at the same time as studying math and engineering. So nothing in his immediate background really prepared him for the career of a composer as such, and certainly not a composer of avant-garde music. He served in the Army Air Corps in World War II, and then upon returning to sort of civil life, studied at the Schillinger School of Music in Boston and eventually moved to Colorado. And he was a figure who was sort of fascinated instinctively by all forms of modernism in the arts. And this was a very significant thing for his development because he was very knowledgeable about contemporary painting and theater and poetry and literature and sculpture and all sorts of things like this. And they had a significant impact on his approach to musical composition. And in a way, I think you could argue that there's no way that he could have been the sort of radically innovative composer that he was if he had had a much more traditional grounding in composition. Now, that's not to say that he didn't study composition. He did, in fact, and he did have a very solid technical understanding of music and of composition, but he sort of didn't go through the conventional pathway to becoming a composer. And that's a very significant thing. So basically, he was very knowledgeable about things like late 19th century French poetry and avant-garde painting and surrealism and data and all this sort of thing, and wanted to sort of bring those sorts of innovations directly to bear on musical composition.
One of the things that interests me very much is the relationship of contemporary music and contemporary musical activity to the other arts, and I believe very much that people, if they would like to understand contemporary music, they must pay attention to contemporary painting, literature, poetry, and in general, the 20th century poetic vocabulary, It's a fascinating subject because a great deal of 20th century aesthetics and the work of 20th century artists of all kinds comes from such things as the way the work of James Joyce influenced my thinking about time and structure and multiplicity, yes, and the poetry of Stefan Mallarmé, the writings of Gertrude Stein, the painting, especially painting and sculpture, has been tremendously influential on my work. And I've been, for instance, the thing that is most well known about my work is the kind of open form, mobile work that I do, compositions that are open form and mobile. And that was an influence from the mobiles of Alexander Calder, the American sculptor.
Now, in Europe, in the immediate post-war period, composers tended to be very preoccupied with notions of musical grammar and rules and sort of creating new systems of musical organization that were an outgrowth of things that had happened earlier. So specifically things like the Second Viennese School and 12-tone music, obviously, and composers such as Anton Weber and Arnold Schoenberg. And basically, Earle Brown is coming at this from a very different perspective. So he's just interested in aesthetic radicalism. He's interested in pushing the boundaries. He's interested in all sorts of things and seeing sort of how far you can go in a given direction. And one thing that's always struck me is that the sort of European avant-garde in the immediate post-war period got into radical forms of musical expression because they were trying to, in their view, basically save civilization and remodel it and create a new sort of image of what a human being and what civilization could be after the sort of enormous cataclysm of the Second World War. Americans at the same time are getting into avant-garde forms of artistic expression because it's just so much more fun than everything else that was going on at the same time. I mean, so there's a very interesting sort of schism in American music in this period where on the one hand you have composers such as Milton Babbitt, for example, or Elliott Carter. Now they're very different from each other, obviously, but they were both of those composers, I think you could say safely, were very preoccupied with the search for a new way of organizing music according to systems and rules and rather complex and sophisticated sort of pre-compositional work. So, in other words, setting up rather elaborate systems within which they could operate, that they could use to build their individual works upon. And then on the other hand, you have people like John Cage and Earle Brown, Morton Feldman, Christian Wolff. So these are all New York-based composers. They're part of the so-called New York School of Composition. And they're going at things from a radically different approach. They're basically trying to achieve a kind of radical spontaneity in their work and a kind of extreme openness. And they're not interested in building systems. They're not interested in sort of imposing external forms of ordering onto their music. And that was certainly a radical break also with what was happening in Europe at the time. But what eventually transpired, what eventually became clear, is that if you push these two directions far enough, they start to become identical. That's a very, very, very interesting thing that I'm sure none of the composers at the time working in these different modes would have necessarily predicted. So you have things like the Boulez piece, Structure, which is written in such a way where the composer is basically removed from the process. The composer doesn't make any real decisions except for determining the parameters of the sort of musical world and then sort of setting up this machine so that the piece basically writes itself. I mean, it's a piece that could have been almost written by a computer, really. And everything is determined in advance according to a rigid sort of system of logic and grammar that the composer sets up. And then at the same time, or almost the same time, you have a work such as John Cage's Music of Changes, which was written by throwing dice and consulting the I Ching and things like this. So, a piece in which there is absolutely no ordering system whatsoever. It's written completely randomly. And if you push these two things far enough, that is chaos and order, you end up in the same place. Getting back to Earle Brown, what he did that, in my view, is so interesting and innovative and sets him apart from his colleagues is that he kind of understood this sort of dichotomy between order and chaos, and he found a number of ingenious ways to make sure that in his work both were manifested and both sort of contribute to the music in a meaningful way. So he has a lot of aspects of his music that are very carefully controlled and determined in advance and that are musically significant. They are not conceived of randomly. They're not it's not him taking himself out of the compositional process. But at the same time, you have this search for a fundamental openness and spontaneity in the realization of the scores. I mentioned earlier that at a certain point around 1950 or 1951, he moves to Colorado, and he meets John Cage there in Denver. And John Cage, by that point, was already well known as a radical musical innovator. And I think it would be wrong to say that he necessarily influenced Earle Brown, but I think that in a sense you could say that John Cage gave Earle Brown permission, or at least provided sort of an example of someone working in a very radical direction in musical composition, and doing so in a way that was aesthetically valid and compelling. So he meets John Cage. They have all sorts of very lengthy discussions, and he's very stimulated by this encounter. And Cage invites him to write a piece that will be part of a sort of collective composition created by a number of different composers. And he writes a short little work, maybe 3 or 4 minutes long, for this event that John Cage is organizing. And then basically right after that, so up to that point, Earle Brown had been writing music. He was already a composer, but he was writing in a relatively conventional 12-tone idiom. Well, not conventional. It depends on what your frame of reference is. I mean, a lot of people would find his early work incredibly difficult to listen to and radical already, even before he meets John Cage. But nevertheless, it was work that was being done within a fairly established, by that point, framework of composition. But after he meets John Cage, he really goes off the deep end and starts investigating all sorts of extremely new, innovative things in his music. So he writes a piece in 1952 called Folio and Four Systems. And that is a very, very significant piece. And it is one that basically sort of accompanied him throughout his entire career. And I think you could certainly argue that it is probably his best known work even today. And one of the major sort of sources of inspiration, one of the things that really contributed to his aesthetic, I think, were the mobiles of Alexander Calder. So Alexander Calder was a sculptor who was making these things called mobiles. So I'll show what that looks like here. And mobiles are sculptures in which the different elements of it are not welded together. They're not fixed together. So depending on how you arrange the sculpture, they can be configured differently, and they will appear differently from one day to the next. And some of the sculptures are placed in outdoor gardens so that the wind will actually sort of blow them around, and they will never appear exactly the same way twice, even though obviously the elements, the components of the sculpture do not change. So Earle Brown was fascinated by this, and certainly began to think about how you could possibly do this in music. So in other words, you have elements that are fixed, that have a clear and straightforward identity, but their relationship to one another is not fixed, and it's determined spontaneously, and it's sort of a floating relationship. So he's thinking about different ways that he can achieve this kind of thing in music. So he wants very clearly, he wants this sort of spontaneity and openness, and he starts reflecting on classical music, which he knows very well, and he's thinking to himself, well, what is it that happens in modern art that doesn't happen in classical music? And he's thinking about this, and he realizes, spontaneity. It's this sort of edgy, sort of an edge of your seat experience in the listening experience, where you really don't know what's going to happen next. And so if you take the example of a Beethoven sonata, for example, I mean, the piece is obviously written out very carefully, and the performers are going to be following the text. They're not going to be making a lot of decisions spontaneously as they're playing the piece. So that doesn't mean that the performers don't have any creative input into the way the piece sounds when it's actually performed, but it's a very different relationship to the score than what he was after. He wanted something where the piece would be an experience that would sound different each time it was performed. So the piece would have some degree of cohesive identity. Now, obviously, it depends on the score, because some of them are wide open and some of them are not. Some of them are, like music for cello and piano, relatively strict in terms of how they're written. But he wants a sort of quality in the performance where you don't know precisely how the other performers are going to react from one moment to another. So that gives them a very palpable excitement and energy and spontaneity, and that was a very big preoccupation for him throughout his compositional career. So we're going to get back to folio and four systems in a second, because I want to talk about that work before I get into music for cello and piano. But just quickly, I will say that the piece Music for Cello and Piano was premiered very significantly in the German city of Darmstadt on July 27th, 1957, by Werner Taube and Alois Kontarski. So these were both sort of major champions of radical avant-garde music in the 1950s. Kontarski was very associated with Stockhausen, for example. And I say it's very significant because the city of Darmstadt hosted, and still hosts today, it's still ongoing, a sort of summer festival of avant-garde music. So it would happen every 2 years, so every other summer. The international avant-garde music community would convene in this little city, which is about 45 minutes, I think, or half an hour away from Frankfurt. And it's sort of like a gigantic convention where composers can attend symposiums and concerts and sort of meet all sorts of different people and see what their colleagues are doing around the world. And this was a very significant thing historically, because the Darmstadt summer courses began in 1946, and that is not a coincidence. So it basically was a concerted effort to rebuild German culture according to radically new precepts. So it is not a sort of regard on the past. It is not a question of trying to rebuild sort of the previous manifestations of culture exactly, but to try to build something new and something innovative, and to have that be a hallmark of German ingenuity going forward after this catastrophe. So the more innovative, the more radical, the more unusual, the better, as far as the Darmstadt festival was concerned. So it's very significant that this piece, written by an American, was premiered in Darmstadt in 1957 and had a very significant impact on the European contemporary music community. So to talk about folio and four systems, this is a sort of digest of 8 scores that Earle Brown created, each of which uses a different form of musical notation. And in each case, it's a very radical form of musical notation. So the piece December 1952, arguably Earle Brown's most famous score, is the piece that you see here at the left. So yes, that is actually a musical score, and that is the entire score of the piece, although there is also a set of instructions that we will look at in a second. So this piece, December 1952, much to Earle Brown's eternal irritation, became his most famous work. And whenever his music was talked about in books or discussed in newspapers or whatever, there would always be a little reproduction of this score, just to sort of show just how crazy his music was. And in fact, certainly the first encounter I ever had with his music was when I was a teenager, and I read Paul Griffith's book on avant-garde music. And of course, there was the requisite sort of reproduction of this piece by Earle Brown, and you would look at it and think, how on earth is this a musical score, and how could this have any significance musically, and what exactly is going on here? So I mean, it's not surprising that this piece would attract so much curiosity. So just want to have a quick look at it and figure out really what's going on and what this whole thing is about. So Earle Brown never considered this to be a piece per se. He considered it to be an activity. So in other words, it's something you do with musicians in order to sort of as an experiment to see what's going to come out of it. When you look at this thing, I mean, it obviously doesn't look like a score. There's no staff lines, there's no dynamics, there's no notes, there's nothing of the sort. It looks more like a Mondrian painting actually than a musical composition. So nevertheless, there's a set of instructions that kind of shed some light on what's going on. So in his instructions, he has this drawing here at the left, which shows that the piece can be read along sort of 3 different, I guess you could call them dimensions. So left to right, back to front, and from up to down. So that's one thing. And then the other thing is that it consists of horizontal and vertical lines of varying length and varying thickness, and the thickness of the lines corresponds to intensity, so how loud the sound is. So just to have a look at the instructions here, the composer says this about the work. He says, the composition may be performed in any direction, from any point in the defined space, for any length of time, and may be performed from any of the 4 rotational positions in any sequence. In a performance utilizing only 3 dimensions as active, vertical, horizontal, and time, the thickness of the event indicates the relative intensity and/or, where applicable instrumentally, clusters. Where all 4 dimensions are active, the relative thickness and length of events are functions of their conceptual position on a plane perpendicular to the vertical and horizontal plane of the score. In the latter case, all of the characteristics of sound and their relationships to each other are subject to continual transformation and modification. It is primarily intended that performances be made directly from this graphic implication, one for each performer, and that no further preliminary defining of the events, other than an agreement as to total performance time, take place. Further defining of the events is not prohibited, however, provided that the imposed determinate system is implicit in the score and in these notes. Okay, so basically what this is, what December 1952 is a diagram without any content. And it's not a piece. It doesn't really contain anything. What it is exactly is, I think it's probably better to think of it as a filter. So in other words, the performer has to provide the content. The performer has to provide the sounds, the instruments, the playing techniques, has to determine how long it will be, and so on. But given that, they will then use this piece to determine essentially how long they will remain on any given action, how to superimpose them or not superimpose them, how loud those actions will be, and so on and so forth. And of course, there are multiple levels of decision-making that the performers must make in terms of interpreting this thing. But basically, there is no content. The performer has to provide that. So that's one of certainly the most radical notational experiments that Earle Brown ever did, and it was by no means normative in his practice. So this is an extreme example, and I can understand why it irritated him so much that this piece was something that he was so closely associated with when he wrote a very large number of conventionally notated pieces of tremendous quality, and he was sort of being painted out as a kind of somewhat dilettantish experimenter, doing these pieces with no content. But that's not really true. This was something that he experimented with for less than a year in the course of a very long career. So you should bear that in mind. So getting back to music for cello and piano, I've got at the bottom of the screen here an excerpt from the score. This is the first system from the score, and this piece is laid out according to a grid. So every page contains exactly 3 systems. And that's actually something that you get also in Morton Feldman, which I talked about in my video on Morton Feldman's bass clarinet and percussion. And it's something that you also occasionally get in John Cage. So the layout is the same on every page. You have 3 systems per page. And what Earle Brown specifies in the instructions for this piece is that each system has to last the same amount of time in performance. And the maximum amount of time that this can be is 15 seconds. So the performer determines the tempo of the piece by choosing the how long, what duration each system will have. So it can be 15 seconds, it can be 14, whatever. It could be 10 seconds, but whatever that duration is, it has to apply to every system in the piece. So you'll notice that this score has neither time signature nor bar lines nor any sort of rational rhythmic subdivisions such as quarter notes, half notes, eighth notes, and so on. You just have note heads and then these sort of black lines that sort of run across the page and indicate, not absolutely, but relatively speaking, how the events are meant to be positioned relative to each other. So what's interesting about this notation is that it looks very free and very radical when you first see it, but it turns out that if you want to do a sort of faithful version of the piece and really bring out the text as much as possible and stay close to the text, you don't actually have all that much freedom. So this type of notation certainly generates a certain type of surface quality and a certain type of performance expressivity, but it's not a carte blanche to the performer to do whatever they want. That's not it at all. So we don't have conventionally notated durations, but nevertheless, you're meant to respect the order of events on the score and their relative sort of spatial representation in terms of actual time, actual chronometric time. So if we look at the piano part here, the piece starts off with a high A, which is prolonged by a sort of black bar there, and then just after the high A, there's a C sharp in the bass clef, marked mezzo piano, and the high A starts first, and then you have the C sharp in the bass register, and the two notes are meant to stop more or less at the same time, and then shortly after that, the cello plays a D in the treble clef, and so on and so forth. So you have to respect the order of events in the score and their approximate relative duration, according to the way it's written graphically. And so what that means is, because there's no sort of stable referent, there's no underlying pulse, the performers, they can rehearse all they want, but in an actual performance situation, there's going to be a very high degree of spontaneity and a degree of indeterminacy in terms of precisely where the events are going to lie that will condition the performance and will lend it a very specific type of expressivity that is very, very engaging and very compelling in my view. This type of notation had a very significant impact on many European composers, and there are many, many examples of scores that used it subsequently, in many cases sort of years or decades later. So, for example, the Swiss composer Heinz Holliger, in a number of pieces that he wrote in the 1970s, uses this notation almost identically. So pieces like the first string quartet, or his Studie über Merklange for solo oboe uses this notation, where each system is meant to last a set amount of time, and then it's notated proportionally or graphically within that time frame. I'd like to talk about the aesthetic precepts of this work, and not just in terms of what he was trying to do himself, but in terms of how this actually translates into an aesthetic and musical experience for the listener. So I'd like to also look at it not just in terms of analyzing what happens in the score, but also phenomenologically. So what actually happens in our perception when we're listening to this music. So to start that off, here's a terrific quote from Earle Brown, who says, "Music for cello and piano is a completely subjectively composed work in what I call time notation, contrary to metric, which is now referred to as proportional notation." So that's a very revealing quote, and it tells us a very, very important, a very key piece of information, which is that the piece is written subjectively. In other words, there is no consciously, logically ordained form of structure or logic in this work. He didn't sit down and create sketches. There are no patterns really to be found in the piece, simply because it doesn't contain any. So I mean, analyzing it as though it were a serial piece or anything else of this sort is absolutely futile. There is no structuring of that sort in this work. And when you actually start looking at the score closely, you notice a certain number of things very quickly. One is that there is a total absence of grammar, logic, rhetoric in the music writing, and there is absolutely no element whatsoever of surprise, directionality, or memory. So you think about this for a second, and you might wonder, well, what on earth is left? I mean, when you get rid of pattern, when you get rid of surprise, when you get rid of memory, I mean, what exactly is left? And so the answer to that turns out to be fairly simple. What's left is sound and texture. So I'll talk about that in a second. But first I want to talk about this idea of surprise. So what do I mean by saying that there is no element of surprise in this music? Well, basically the piece has essentially the same basic texture from beginning to end. And obviously, it's a piece that, like any piece of music, has different parameters. It exists in different dimensions. So there's a pitch parameter, there's a durational parameter, there's intensity, there's the relative complexity of events, and so on. And all of these different parameters, to some degree, are in flux throughout the course of the work. I mean, they're not absolutely static, but nevertheless, there's no directional tendency in terms of how these different parameters function in the piece. So you don't have sections of the work where he says, okay, I'm just going to concentrate on this one little register of the piano, or I'm going to have a solo for the cello, or I'm going to sort of gradually have a process that leads us up to the high register, or anything like that. There's absolutely nothing of the sort in this piece. So you can take any one system of it and sort of permutate it with any other system, and you basically end up with the same piece with the same qualities. There's no dramaturgy to it. There's no overarching shape to it. And basically, the events, they arrive at our perception at such a low level of resolution that they're not going to stick in your mind particularly long. And each new subsequent event in the piece, each new sound event, will tend to cancel out the one before it. You're going to be focusing on each event as it happens, and you're not going to be relating them to what happened earlier or to what's about to happen, because there's no sort of context that's detailed enough for us to be able to do that. So you tend to hear this music statistically in terms of greater or lesser complexity, greater or lesser intensity, or simplicity, or what, how loud it is or how quiet it is. You will sort of hear it in these kind of clumps where it's got a rough kind of cohesion to the way the texture is at any given moment, but that's going to change the next second, and you'll have no ability to predict that whatsoever. So on the one hand, this results in the piece being memoryless, because you can't relate each new event and future events to previous events in any particular way. You can't compare them, and you can't contrast them. But what that also does, paradoxically, is well, it eliminates surprise. But you're also, at the same time, in a sort of constant state of surprise, because you can't predict what's going to happen next. So that's one thing. So I mean, the piece forces you to focus essentially on texture and sound. But it turns out that those two parameters are complex enough in and of themselves. You don't necessarily need to have all these other things. You don't need to have a sort of structure that can be divided up into sections. You don't necessarily need to have clear functions in the material in order to be able to appreciate it in that way. And it turns out that sound in texture, when they are in flux, and sort of when you have all these different parameters that are sort of being modulated constantly throughout the work, that is what the musicality of the piece is, and that is actually that is a musical phenomenon, and it works brilliantly in this piece. If you're willing, of course, to go on this wild adventure that this piece proposes. So another radically innovative feature of this work is the way that Earle Brown writes for the piano and the cello. So the idea of writing works for a keyboard instrument plus one other instrument is a very old one. It goes back to the early Baroque. And it grows out of actually the Baroque trio sonata, in which you have a keyboard instrument and an accompaniment instrument that is sort of doubling the bass part of the keyboard. And then you might also have a solo instrument on top of that, hence the term trio sonata. And as this form evolved through time, eventually the sort of instrument doubling the bass line fell to the side, and we would just have sort of a melodic instrument plus a keyboard, and that's what you get in Mozart sonatas, for example, for violin and piano. Nevertheless, it would be difficult to think of two more different sounding instruments than a cello and a piano, and that is something that is always a compositional challenge for composers, regardless of the sort of style they're working in. And there tends to be usually some sort of hierarchy between the two instruments, and they're not written for the same way, and you don't have the same division of labor, so to speak, between the solo instrument and the keyboard. So there's all sorts of examples of that. For example, the Beethoven sonatas for cello and piano. Beethoven thought of those as essentially piano sonatas with an added cello part. So the cello is not really a predominant element in these pieces, but the sort of it's the keyboard that is the most important instrument in a sense. And the cello, it's not to say that you could play them without the cello and there'd be no difference, but it's not exactly thought of as a sort of a soloistic piece as such. That's something that starts to happen more and more throughout the Romantic period, where you get these very grand pieces, which are very virtuosic, and things like the Prokofiev flute sonata, for example, for flute and piano. And but again, obviously, keyboard instruments and instruments such as a flute or a cello are very, very different from each other. And so there would always be, very different types of writing that would be idiomatic to each instrument. And what Earle Brown does in music for cello and piano, that is so extraordinary, and I think he really is one of the first composers in history to have done this, is to treat the cello and piano as equivalent, as equal. He writes for them in exactly the same way. So you don't have a foreground-background hierarchy in this piece. The two instruments exist on the same plane. They are given exactly the same type of material. So, for example, the cello routinely plays chords, sort of triple and quadruple stop chords, pizzicato in this piece, and the piano very seldom plays chords in this piece, tends to play more sort of isolated notes, but occasionally does play two or more notes at the same time. But when you hear these, you don't think, yes, a piano chord. You just hear it as a sonic event. These types of materials that he's using aren't functional in the sense that they would be in a more conventional classical piece, and they don't hold for any length of time. So you don't have any particular distinction in texture between the cello and the piano part. And in order to do this and to go as far as possible in this direction, he calls for a number of radical, what were then radical, although today they're used more and more frequently, instrumental techniques. So extended instrumental techniques that go beyond what was sort of taught in conservatories at the time. Things like asking the pianist to put their hand on the string of the piano and then play that note using the keyboard so that the note will be muted, or asking the pianist to reach inside the lid of the piano and pluck individual strings or hit them with mallets. And the cello part also contains all sorts of different techniques as well, but most of those cello techniques were already comparatively familiar from works such as the string quartets by the Second Viennese School, and even Beethoven uses some of these techniques actually in his string quartets. So they're not that new necessarily, but the way that he uses them and the way that he combines them with the piano part is certainly extremely radical and extremely innovative. So that plus this new approach to musical notation results in a work that is extremely interesting and very, very innovative. One really interesting thing you can do with works like this that do not use ordinary notational conventions is to take several different recordings and compare them and sort of try to see what common features they have. Because presumably works like this leave a lot to the performer, because they don't use techniques that are sort of universal. You would think that there would be a certain degree of disparity between the way different performances would sound. And what's really interesting is, in the case of this particular piece, that's actually not the case. So I'm going to demonstrate this by comparing 4 different recordings that were made over a span of 44 years. So this piece is actually performed fairly often, and it has a lengthy performance history by this point. So I'm going to compare the first, very, very, very first recording that was ever made of the piece, which dates from 1962, and going all the way up to a recent recording, well, relatively recent, from 2006. So we'll have an idea of how it was performed soon after its composition and how it's performed today. And what's interesting about this is, well, if you take some of the more extreme pieces by Earle Brown that we looked at earlier, such as December 1952. Well, I mean, obviously, if you take any two different recordings of that work, and by the way, there's quite a few of them on YouTube, so if you're interested, you can just type in Earle Brown, December 1952, and hear a bunch of them and hear what people have made of this piece. They sound completely different. I mean, if you didn't know that it was a performance of December 1952, you would have no idea what it was. And the composer himself has made this remark. He said that a performer once sent him a recording of December 1952, and he put it on, and he had no idea what it was. And it wasn't until he looked at the box and saw, oh yes, it's a version of December 1952. So, but that's not the case with this piece. And what's interesting is just how incredibly similar all four recordings are. The only one that's sort of markedly different, I would say, is the Siegfried Palm recording dating from 1974, which is notably faster than the others. But the three others basically all take a tempo of slightly less than 15 seconds per system. So what I've done here is I've taken page 9 of the score, which I chose because it presents a particularly wide sort of range of different techniques and sounds. It's a particularly varied page of the score, and I'm just going to present the score along with these four recordings, one after the other, so you can hear them and compare them and see how they sound. So obviously they're not identical, and these are all very, very fine performances, and I would recommend any one of them for sure. And each of these performers has a different approach to the piece, but the piece does have a very strong and cohesive identity, and regardless of who's playing it, that comes through, and you can certainly recognize it from one performance to another. So just to finish things off here are four different recordings of page 9 of Music for Cello and Piano.